Welcome, Dr. Thomas. Thank you so much for coming. If you could give us the university and college you teach and also an explanation of your field, that would be great.
So I'm at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, and technically I'm in the Department of Pharmacology, but my background is in neuroscience. I have a PhD in neuroscience, and I also have a medical degree, so a combined degree, which I got from the University of Michigan.
Interesting.
Yeah, and yeah, that's an interesting combination. Really, it's suited best for people who are interested in academic medicine and medical research. But that's a program that not everybody is familiar with, this idea where you can combine medical school and PhD studies in order to really kind of more seriously and rigorously pursue medical research.
I see. Thank you. So how long have you been a professor?
Ooh, 23 years.
Wow, that's amazing. It's a very long time. I see. Great. So do you have any outside hobbies or interests?
Um, I do, and I feel like without those, I would probably go a little crazy. So, um, I definitely like athletic activities. It helps clear the mind and hopefully keeps one healthy.
Mhm.
Um, so bicycling, tennis, those are the two things that I currently do, although I just took 2 backpacking trips this summer, one in Glacier National Park and one in the North Cascades National Park, which was something I hadn't done in many years. So that was a treat to be able to get back to that.
I see. Wonderful. All right. So let's start off with our lead question, which is what led you into your field of study and where do you think it's headed towards in the future?
Yeah, so when I went to college, I decided to major in biochemistry because I felt like the life sciences were fascinating, but I very much liked the quantitative sciences. And so biochemistry provided a nice bridge between the two. Um, then when something I discovered only toward the end of my senior year in college was neuroscience. There was no major at the time in neuroscience in college, and there was a course, however, a neurophysiology course that I signed up to take, in part again because it was sort of a more quantitative area of biology. And that class had a great young professor, very enthusiastic. Um, and that's how I discovered neuroscience, and really what resulted in my interest in the field and ultimately pursuing the field. And you could easily say that, well, that's kind of late. And I don't recommend necessarily deciding your senior year in college. But I think it's good to point out that one doesn't have to know exactly what you want, what you're most interested in, and exactly where you're headed as soon as possible. These things develop over time, and that's okay. And a lot of college, in addition to learning specific subjects, is exploration and being exposure, and getting a better idea of what one's own interests are and what's out there. So I salute you for doing this even before a lot of people do in college. So yes.
Thank you so much for that. All right. So I wanted to ask about specifically about your research. So my question to you is, what questions are you answering in your research if you conducted anything in the past or for the future? And also if you have any data or latest findings in your lab?
Sure. So yes, we've been doing research. I mean, that's been an area of focus for me for many years, even before becoming a professor. So the research really has evolved over time. But one of the areas of focus in the lab is studying some of the neurotransmitter systems, some of the brain chemical communication mechanisms that allow neurons to talk to each other and underlie a whole variety of behaviors, and how things like that work normally and how things like that can go awry and lead to various either neurological or psychiatric disorders.
Mhm.
And ultimately, if you can understand that, perhaps develop, different types of treatments or therapies to ultimately aid in helping people with such disorders.
Mhm.
Um, Go ahead.
So, so you said something about neurons communicating. So the one I know is the communication that happens is through action potentials. Like the synapse and like the neurons releasing chemical neurotransmitters. Is that specifically what you're studying?
That's correct. So you're right. Action potentials basically convey this long range signal from the neuron to other neurons that it communicates with.
Mm.
And at the end of that sort of axon is the terminal.
Mhm.
And when the action potential then reaches the terminal, you get release of the neurotransmitter, which can be actually, a number of different neurotransmitters can be packaged in the same terminal in the same vesicles. So there's usually one kind of classic neurotransmitter, but often maybe one or two other neurotransmitters that are also being released at the same time. So that's referred to as co-transmission. Um, so yeah, we study sort of the effects of some of these transmitters in various brain regions, and again, how they sort of underlie various, say, cognitive processes, like learning and memory is one of the focuses that we study in the lab.
Mhm. So why is it important to understand these neurotransmitter signaling and where it happens?
Yeah. So a great example is dopamine.
Mhm.
So dopamine is a neurotransmitter that does a variety of sort of interesting things. One of the first things that people appreciated about the systems that use dopamine is in one of the neurologic disorders, which is Parkinson's disease. So in Parkinson's, dopamine neurons degenerate, and as a result of that, you end up with motor symptoms, where people have difficulty initiating movement. They may have a resting tremor. And this is unfortunately a progressive disorder whose etiology often is unknown, exactly why people get Parkinson's disease. And so there's a lot of research trying to understand how that happens, why that happens, and can it be prevented or perhaps reversed. But that's an example of one neurotransmitter system that is very clearly linked to a neurologic disorder. There's another side to dopamine. There's multiple sides to dopamine as well as other transmitters. But it's also fairly well known, I think, and that's with respect to drugs of abuse. So drugs that target the dopamine system, examples of that are cocaine or amphetamine. And it's the release of dopamine that can give these feelings of euphoria. And that's fine, except that can lead to chronic drug use and all the problems that can result from that. So there's a lot of effort to understand these other areas of the brain, different from motor control, that dopamine also has a very strong influence with respect to feelings of, like I said, euphoria. So yes, it's not only understanding the neurotransmitter system and how that operates, but then, like we just talked about, the different brain regions that it acts in, and how one brain region may be responsible for one aspect of its function, and then another brain region, another aspect of its function.
Mhm. So what areas are active in the brain when we are like, let's say there's like communication going on inside the brain? What specific and targeted areas are being, I know that when we use like MRI scans to detect how communication and other processes work, we have like different methods to assess that, right? So I was wondering, like, how do you use that to detect how these processes work?
Yeah, there's a whole variety of techniques that one can use. So you mentioned, so there's functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, which is a fantastic technique that allows one to actually do studies with people.
Mhm,
And so it's not invasive, and it helps you identify brain regions that are active, at that moment. And you can ask people to do certain, tasks, or have certain thoughts, and study then the brain regions that are active um, during that activity.
mhm,
Um, and so that's very helpful with respect to human research. A lot of more basic research uses animal models, and that can be a great variety of animal models. Primates are certainly the closest to humans, but with respect to mammals, mice are a very common research organism. But people will use nematodes, which are flatworms. They're very kind of genetically accessible, and fruit flies are also very genetically accessible. And so you find excellent neuroscience research being done in all of those different organisms, and people are, taking advantage of the various aspects of each of those organisms that are, make them, um, really helpful for one's research. Yeah.
mhm. So is there a specific communication system that you study, or is it the overall in general?
Yeah, so one of the systems we started out studying was the cousin of dopamine. So dopamine, it turns out, is actually a precursor for another neurotransmitter, and that
Mhm,
transmitter is norepinephrine. And norepinephrine is a cousin of something probably pretty much everybody's familiar with, which is epinephrine, also known as adrenaline.
mhm,
So we're all familiar kind of with the effects of adrenaline, which tend to be very positive,
mhm,
um, especially if you're, excited or exercising or something like that. Um, and so adrenaline is the same thing as epinephrine. So noradrenaline, same thing as norepinephrine. The noradrenaline norepinephrine system occurs both in the periphery and in the brain. And so we've had a focus on that system for a couple of reasons, and in particular on the system in the brain. So very much like the dopamine system in the brain, but it really is distinct. It's a separate class of neurons, and the projections of those neurons are different. The brain regions that they innervate sometimes overlap with the dopamine neurons, and sometimes have areas that are more unique to the norepinephrine system.
mhm,
I should, so why are we studying norepinephrine?
mhm,
I can give you, sort of two examples like I did for dopamine. One is, um, for example, post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD.
mhm,
So in PTSD, people have experienced one or more, sort of severely traumatic events, and that can lead in some cases, most times it doesn't, but in some cases that can lead to long-term symptoms. These symptoms take time to develop, but um, these people who do develop symptoms have, sort of flashbacks of the traumatic memories that they're sort of unable to suppress. And when they're sleeping, they can have nightmares related to kind of the same thing. Um, they're hypervigilant, and so they're easily startled. They're, they just aren't very relaxed, unfortunately. Um, and there's some very good evidence suggesting that the adrenergic system mediated by norepinephrine, the transmitter, is sort of overactive in those patients. And so, one reason to then better understand what that system does is to what extent can we intervene with, say, the overactivity of the adrenergic system and perhaps provide some benefit to people with PTSD.
I see.
Yeah. A second example is a neurodegenerative disorder, Alzheimer's disease.
Mhm.
So in Alzheimer's disease, there are certain sort of hallmark changes that occur in the brain, and so pathologic changes. And so people talk about plaques and tangles. So these odd sort of pathologic changes that show up in Alzheimer's. And I think most people are familiar with the fact that Alzheimer's is very much a cognitive disorder. It affects learning and memory greatly. And that's also progressive like Parkinson's disease is, and often unknown as to what causes it. But when people look, researchers have looked at very early on in the lifespan of humans and studied brains that have become available. What they found is some of these sort of pathologic changes that are kind of hallmarks for Alzheimer's disease can show up fairly early on before anybody has any symptoms. And one of the first places they will show up is in the norepinephrine system of the brain. And loss of norepinephrine occurs as Alzheimer's disease progresses. So this is sort of the opposite now of PTSD, where if anything, there was sort of an overactive adrenergic system. In Alzheimer's disease, it looks like there's less activity in the adrenergic system. And so our research really is trying to understand sort of both directions. What happens when the adrenergic system is stimulated or overactive, and what happens when it's reduced or impaired. And those two diseases are examples of how it can be affected in both of those directions.
So the lack of norepinephrine is the reason that causes the symptoms that progresses to Alzheimer's?
Well, I can't say that it's as simple as that, but there's evidence to suggest that changes in the adrenergic system, the system that utilizes norepinephrine, may have very important consequences with respect to the progression of the disease and the appearance of symptoms.
Mhm.
So that's something that is very much currently being studied by our lab and by other laboratories.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I see. I was just curious because I know like the lack of dopamine causes like depression, schizophrenia, and like other mental illnesses. So I was just wondering, what's the reason for Alzheimer's?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer to that question is people don't really know yet. And one thing that people are looking at is the norepinephrine system, but it's probably more than that. I suspect that it does play a significant role, but there's other factors that are probably just as important.
Mhm. So
Yeah.
with the systems, back to the systems of the brain, do you know, can you explain like the difference between neurotransmitters and like neuromodulators and neurohormones? I know they're like three different whole things, so I was just curious.
Yeah, so these are all mechanisms through which cells can communicate.
Mhm.
So there's, and I was saying before, there's this idea of co-transmission. So you can have release of, sort of the classic neurotransmitter, and then you can have release of co-transmitters. Sometimes these are peptides, so neuropeptides. And then neurohormones tend to be, factors that are released into the bloodstream, so into the circulation, and then they kind of travel throughout the body, and then they can affect various physiological processes throughout the body, including the brain. So often these hormones can cross the blood-brain barrier, enter the brain, and then have effects on brain function as well. But yes, there's sort of different time scales that go along with these. Neurotransmitters can act on sort of the millisecond time scale, Neuropeptides tend to act more slowly over seconds and minutes. And then hormones tend to act even more slowly over minutes to even hours. So yeah, that's another sort of distinction between those different means of communication.
So let's say this action potential is like damaged. Like what were to happen to the cerebral cortex?
Yes, so there's several diseases that are referred to as demyelinating diseases.
Mhm.
And so neurons, and in particular the axons, have insulation. It's like a wire. So you have the copper wire, which is the axon, and then you have the plastic over the copper wire, and that's the insulation. And so the insulation, keeps the signal within that wire. It prevents, cross-circuiting and short-circuiting. So neurons do something similar. Their axons are actually insulated as well, but they're insulated by other cells that wrap processes around their axons. And that process is referred to as myelin.
Mhm.
And so when the myelin is lost, these axons become demyelinated and they don't work properly anymore. And an example of that is multiple sclerosis. So when demyelination occurs in the brain or spinal cord in the central nervous system, there's a whole variety of symptoms that can occur depending on where in the brain the demyelination occurs. It tends to be relatively patchy, at least initially. Another example is Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a peripheral demyelination. And so there you can lose the ability to, essentially activate your muscles and become somewhat paralyzed. And the most extreme form of that is if you lose the ability to activate, the muscles in your thorax and can no longer breathe, then you actually need to be on a breathing machine, at least until the body can sort of recover and heal itself and remyelinate, which can take weeks in the case of that disorder. So that's an example of where, if axon communication is impaired, you can have, very serious consequences, as you might expect.
I see. So are there any misconceptions in your field of study?
Well, there's certainly a lot that we still need to learn. Neuroscience to me is very fascinating in that I would say the human brain is probably the most complicated structure in at least the known universe. The number of neurons and then the number of synapses between neurons is almost too much to conceive. It's so large. It's thought that every neuron has maybe about 10,000 synapses, and there are hundreds of billions of neurons. And so it's, yes, it's extremely complex. And at this point, we've really only scratched the surface in trying to understand even simpler nervous systems. So there's a tremendous amount, that is still yet to be learned. So yes, it's both fascinating and the potential in the field is tremendous as far as what's to come.
I see. So have you ever come across any disagreements, especially since you're in the field of science?
Well, so sure. So I think the thing we all try to do is do the best experiments we can and come up with the most reproducible data we can. But experiments can be done in different ways, different approaches, and sometimes that can lead to different answers or different conclusions. And so then it's really up to us to try and determine the advantages and disadvantages of each approach, what might be potential explanations for seemingly getting one answer with this approach and maybe another answer with this other approach. So you're always trying to decide, if if I see a result, is it due to the reasons that I think it might be due to, or what other possible reasons or explanations are there? And sometimes they could just be technical reasons. So you know, yeah, it can be complicated.
Yeah, especially since there's a lot of views and perceptions to how people approach problems or see things, especially in research. So I totally agree with that.
Yeah, yeah. You know, it's we all come into these experiments with certain ideas and hypotheses and
Mhm.
um, you know, things that are to be tested, and sometimes the experiments confirm those ideas, and sometimes they will lead you in new directions, and that can be very exciting. You know, it's the really unexpected outcome that you know you may ultimately learn the most from, and can be very interesting to follow up on, even if it wasn't an answer you were initially anticipating.
I see. So to sum up, as my final question, I wanted to ask, who or what was your inspiration to pursue the field, and also any advice for younger students who want to be in a similar field to yours?
Yeah, so you know, I talked about this a little bit before. The professor in the neurophysiology course that I took my senior year was very influential, and then he brought in some guest lecturers who some of were experts in the learning and memory field, and so that you know not only just helped me gravitate toward neuroscience, but got me very interested in learning and memory, and those are you know part of some of the things that we continue to study to this day in the lab. Um, and it's very hard to predict, you know, when these things might happen for any individual, as far as when you might get exposed to, you know, something that all of a sudden, you know, puts a little light off in your head, and you end up pursuing it. Um, that can happen at any time. So I would just recommend, you know, to keep your mind and your ears and your eyes open, uh,
Mhm.
and follow your nose, in the sense that you know, as you find things of interest to you, you know, express that. Let people know. Let you know, it can be a teacher or um, you know, colleagues, students, and so forth. And you will get, you know, more and more input, and find out more about those areas, and you know, potentially pursue them. Yeah.
I see. Thank you for the advice. Do you have anything to add last minute? Or
Um, I don't think so. Yeah.
that's great. Oh, well, yeah. I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming today. I appreciate your time. I really did learn a lot. So, yeah.
Yes, well, I wish everybody who watches this good luck, and and it was a pleasure getting to talk to you. I'm very impressed that you're already thinking about these things, and then taking advantage of these opportunities that you've set up. That's really fantastic.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I hope you have a great day.
Thank you very much, Darshani. Nice meeting you.
Nice meeting you too. Bye.
Okay, bye.